All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the December Electric Railroaders Association meeting. I'm pleased to be back. I know I had very capable virtual ushers in Sasha Ivanov in September and Paul Grether in October. So I have a few announcements. First of all, our next meeting is Friday, January 21st. Our speaker will be Jack May. Jack May is a longtime member of ERA, our Trips and Convention Chair. He was also a board member. His program is yet to be announced, but it is always an excellent program. You won't want to miss that. Second announcement is we have sent the flyer out for our Electric Railroaders Association San Diego convention. That will be based in San Diego, but it's San Diego and Southern California. The dates of that are July 7 through 10. The information should have come in the last mailing and hard copy, or again, you can go on erausa.org for that information. Mike Glicken, do you want to say something about the other trip? Mike, you want to unmute?
Yes, we are planning our first international trip since 2018 to Greece, and that will be 11 days beginning in New York. If you fly to Greece, you have to fly out on September 7th. And we'll basically be visiting Athens quite extensively, both tourism and transit, and Thessaloniki, which is otherwise known as Salonika. And we'll get quite a nice ride up the coast, one way by road and one way by their new high-speed rail. And it will include a ride on a narrow gauge steam line in the Greek mountains around Salonika. Should be a nice trip, and it's not as ambitious as our former trips, but at this time, it's best to leave it to one country. Crossing borders could still be a problem come next fall.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Michael. Other announcements. I want to wish everyone in advance a very happy holidays, whether it's belated Hanukkah, Christmas, or whatever holiday you are celebrating, and Happy New Year. January 1, ERA starts a new fiscal year. If you have yet to renew your membership, please do so. Also, members have been very generous with donations, so donations really help underwrite these programs, plan for trips, and hopefully after the pandemic does subside, we will consider also doing more local trips in the New York and in the tri-state area. But right now that is suspended. Our two trips are the San Diego trip and the trip to Greece. Anyone who's on here who is not a member, please, you are welcome. I hope you enjoy the program. If you like what you see, membership details are at erausa.org, and you click on membership, and all the details are there, and you can join online. I believe that is all the announcements I have, except to introduce our special speaker tonight. If there's anything that I forgot, please feel free to direct message to me. Before I introduce David, let me explain how we run our programs for those who are new to ERA programs. Everybody is muted except myself, and the speaker. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. From time to time, I will look for a logical pause in David Wilson's presentation, and I will present the question. Sometimes if it's a very basic question, one of our other very knowledgeable members will answer the question, and that happens from time to time. Also, David will stick around at the end, at the conclusion of his presentation, and be free. It'll be open forum. Everyone will be unmuted. You can turn on your video, and then you can have a discussion with David at the end. In the meantime, please put all your comments and questions in the chat thread. All right, so at this time, I'm going to introduce David Wilson. His presentation is called Manhattan Transfer. This is part 1 of 2. It was presented about a year ago to the Central Electric Rail Fans Association, and I think they had a record-breaking 300 people participate. I think that's the most for any Zoom presentation of any rail club. We're at 110 right now, but I don't know that we'll make 300, but we're doing pretty well, David. You have a lot of people from the transit industry, transit and transportation planning industry who are on here. Oh, one other thing before I describe David further. Despite what we said earlier about it not being recorded, we will be recording this presentation, but we are going to be doing a different procedure from the past. We will post a link on the website. So if you have friends that did not see the presentation and they want to see it, I will have my email. They will have to email me, and only members, only paid up ERA members can see the presentation. I will verify that the person requested is a paid up member, and then I will send them a private link. That's to avoid any copyright issues, and we have to do it that way. So that's that. So anyway, getting back to David Wilson. So Manhattan Transfer Show will trace the purpose, construction, expansion, decline, and revival of transportation systems on the Hudson River waterfront from the first railroads in the 19th century to the introduction of present-day light rail and ferry service. Manhattan Transfer is more than a fictional name for Penn Station, immortalized in the titular model by John Dos Passos for nearly 2 centuries. 8 railroads, streetcar operations, and a subway line all surmounted obstacles in northern New Jersey to reach the Hudson River waterfront, where passengers could transfer to ferry boats or H&M subway trains to gain access to Manhattan. David has been writing, observing, documenting, and loving railroads and public transit for nearly 60 years. He began touring transit systems in his teens, including his first visit to New York, Hoboken, and Newark when he was 17 years old. He has since made 14 visits to Hoboken and surrounding communities. He has a Bachelor of Business Administration from Kent State University, along the main line of the Erie-Lackawanna, and a Master of Urban Planning and Policy from the University of Illinois at Chicago. In 2015, David retired from his 48-year career in transportation management, having worked in marketing for 4 railroads, and finished his career as a bus route planner for CTA. He has since authored a book and various articles on transportation history in Chicago, and has given numerous, I may say, excellent presentations on various aspects of transportation history and operations. This is a very comprehensive, very great presentation with many rare photos. That's my editorial comment. That was not his. And Dale, I see you online. I forgot to tell you the original railroad wasn't just called the Hudson Tubes. It was, the official name was the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad, and was the H&M Tubes. And with that, David, I've given you license to share your screen. So David, I'm turning it over to you.
All right, here we go. this is always the scary part to get it going. What do you see?
Right now I see a blank screen.
Now, do you see anything?
Not yet. What do you see? What do you have? Do you have your presentation up?
I did. I'm gonna do it again.
Make sure all your other windows are closed except for the PowerPoint. Every window, no File Explorer, no Word, no Excel, or anything else.
Bear with me for a moment.
Sure.
Even though we already practiced all this, you'd think that I would have had it figured out. We'll get one of those out of the way.
It's fine. Take your time.
I'm having to scramble around on the screen because I upgraded this morning to Windows 11 and stuff looks different. So I should have everything closed.
Okay.
I'm now going to share screen.
Okay.
And let's try this one. Now, what do you see?
Yes, we see it. So now you just need to make it full screen and you're all set to go.
Like
there you
that.
go. You're good. You're perfect.
All right.
Oh, perfect.
Okay. So first of all, I want to thank you for this opportunity to present to ERA. I've been somewhat familiar with ERA since I read about it in Trolley Car Treasury when I was in about 5th grade. So I'm especially honored to be able to present here. So let's on with the show. Manhattan Transfer, crossing the Hudson to Manhattan, how it came to be the way it is. So first, I want to start out by saying, it's a filthy, disgusting job having to research all this stuff. I counted up. I think that this summer were my 17th and 18th trips to Hoboken since I originally visited when I was a senior in high school. So on this particular occasion, I was at the little restaurant there at the corner right across from the path entrance, having my beer and supper and watching the commuters coming out of the subway, some of whom were rather fetching. So with that, we'll get on to the show with a little bit of humor to start out with. Well, how do you get to New York when you're not from New York, like me? The first thing I would try would be to ride a Pittsburgh streetcar that signed up Gotham City via Batcave. I tried that, didn't get me there. New Yorkers took a moment to have a little poking fun at themselves on this cover of the New Yorker. What does the nation look like to a New Yorker? Well, there's Manhattan and the Hudson River, and then everything else. So we're going to start this off with a little bit of a geography lesson. I understand that many of you see this scenery practically every day or are quite familiar with it, but just for general reference so that everybody understands what's going on here, you have Manhattan, which is where we're trying to get to, the Hudson River. So anybody who wanted to build toward the Hudson River and Manhattan from the west had several barriers. First, the Passaic River, then the Meadowlands, wetlands, then the Hackensack River, and then the Palisades, the ridge, and then finally get down to the little shelf between the ridge and the river where you needed to squeeze in all of your terminal facilities and whatnot. Looking at it a little bit more topographically. So you have this, oh, wait a minute, I needed something I figured out today, pointer options, laser pointer. Oh yeah, there we go. Oh. So Manhattan Island, the river, the ridge, the Meadowlands, the river, the other river. So anybody who wanted to build there, it was a little challenging. Our railroads that we're going to be covering tonight, you'll be very familiar by the end, namely the CNJ, Central New Jersey, the Lehigh Valley, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Erie, the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western were leaping over this one. What this terminal was the oil docks, and it's purely a freight terminal. So I'm not going to be focused on that. The West Shore terminal, where they came through the tunnel. And then I'm also ignoring the NYS&W up at Englewood, because the important part of NYS&W was to gain access down this direction. So in the beginning being 1812, a ferry boat, the first steam ferry boat, was established from Paulus Hook in what's now Jersey City, across to Manhattan. Another ferry ran to Elizabethport. The state of New York granted a monopoly charter for the ferry operator. And in 1824, another person wanted to run a boat, and they sued each other over the rights, and it led to a Supreme Court case called Gibbons versus Ogden, one of the foundational Supreme Court cases early in our nation, that held that if a New York charter going to New Jersey is interstate, not intrastate, and it's established the legal principle of federal control of interstate commerce, that for people like me who came up in the railroad industry, that was a really important thing. But we'll get on now to railroads. In the 1830s, there was one of the earliest railroads in America was the Camden and Amboy, that actually now has light rail on part of it, down at the bottom end there, between Camden and Trenton. But then shortly after that, another company that was soon to be affiliated with it was the New Jersey Railroad and Transportation Company. The reason they called it that is because they weren't sure yet whether they wanted to do railroads or ferry boats or just what, maybe even stagecoaches. But the important thing was there was a desire to build a railroad from farther south, in the nation's most important corridor at the time, and arguably still is, to the Hudson River, where you could take a ferry boat to New York. At the same time, at Paterson, New Jersey, there is a giant waterfall, just tremendous energy being generated there by this water coming over the dam. And in the 1830s, when steam power was really still an embryonic concept, water power was very important for industry. So what happened was that Paterson became a very early industrial center. So if you're making a lot of stuff in Paterson, and there's a big population in New York, you want to get stuff from Paterson to New York. So let's have a railroad. With the result that now you had two railroads, the New Jersey Railroad and Transportation, depicted in red, arcing around from the south, and the Paterson and, he looks at his notes, Paterson and Hudson River, aptly named, from Paterson down on what became the Erie Railroad mainline, down to the west side of the ridge. Initially, they laid tracks over the top of the ridge, but as soon as they were able to, they established a line through a cut that was, he's looking at his notes here. I was going to, Shanley's Cut. This is Shanley's Cut. So the NJRR&T, New Jersey Railroad and Transportation, built its line to the Hudson River at what we later knew as Exchange Place. And in order to do that, they hewed this cut out of the ridge. It was a community of interest. The Paterson and Hudson River also used the same cut. So the two came down through the ridge, down to the waterfront, the New Jersey Railroad Terminal, taking note here of Montgomery Street, because Montgomery Street will be our friend throughout this presentation. And then this is erroneously labeled here. George and I already talked about this. It should be the Patterson and Hudson River Terminal. So that's what it looked like in 1844. This is what it looked like from the, as you looked at the terminal and with the New York skyline, such as it was in the background, the two terminals next to each other. Then in 1836, the Morris and Essex Railroad was established. The Morris and Essex that many of us knew fondly because of the Lackawanna electrification, they wanted to build to the Hudson River. So they came through on the same, through the same cut. There was a little complication there, that it was the Morris and Essex rapidly developed a relationship with the DL&W, Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, which in its early days, like the Erie, was a 6-foot gauge line. So you now had 3 railroads going through the cut on a dual gauge track. So this is an overhead view of the area where, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. It was soon determined that the Shanley's cut wasn't big enough for everybody, because now you had also the CNJ was coming through there. And so the Erie decided, yeah, we're going to make a separate arrangement. So this map where you see the blue coming down, I have it depicted as when it went through Shanley's cut, but they dug a tunnel. It was that tunnel that you see right there in the, where I've got it highlighted. This tunnel was known as the Long Dock Tunnel because there was a land company along the Hudson River called the Long Dock Company that worked in conjunction with the Erie to develop their terminal facilities. So this is what it looks like on the steam-powered video atlas, the Erie mainline coming down, going through where you see this series of this is actually a later version of the Erie, and we'll get to that in a moment. The PRR, successor to the New Jersey Railroad and Transportation, coming over from this way, as well as the Lackawanna next to the PRR. And those, of course, will figure later on. They will figure into the story later on. So this was what the Long Dock Tunnel looked like. The Long Dock Tunnel was opened in 1861. And so what then happened, instead of the Erie coming down through Shanley's cut down to the the land right next to the PRR, they established their own terminal at a place called Pavonia. So now you had 2 railroads. Then the Central Railroad of New Jersey came along. They opened a route from Elizabethport, now Elizabeth, to a new terminal in Communipaw. Now, your options to get through across 2 rivers and a swamp and a big hill, you could either go over the top, which is what the Patterson and Hudson River and the New Jersey Railroad initially did, or you could hew out a cut, which is what those 2 railroads did after that, or you could do an end run, which is what the CNJ did. They, coming up from the south, built a long bridge. You know, it's fine. Okay, so we don't have to do any tunneling, and that's a wonderful thing. But that meant that you had to cross Newark Bay. This is what the Newark Bay CNJ bridge looked like. And I'm going to see if I can expand this image to depict the fact that it was not only a long trestle, but it required a movable span bridge in order to accommodate ocean-going vessels. It's an unfortunate thing that happened in 1958. The CNJ train, I think it's still unexplained exactly what happened, but this train came hurtling toward the open the bridge in a lift. The bridge deck was up to accommodate a vessel, and for unexplained reasons, the engineer only applied the brakes in the last few hundred feet, with the result that the locomotive and one or more cars plunged into Newark Bay.
Wow. David, there was a question from the audience. If when you were showing the map with the 3 different routes to the Hudson River waterfront, were they interconnected in such a way that if they were all in existence today, one could get from Exchange Place to Secaucus without a transfer, or were they all sort of independent of each other?
They, so far as I can understand, they shared trackage through Shanley's Cut, and then dispersed to their respective stations. Those 2 stations that I showed at the outset. And I don't have detailed notes as to what terminal the Morrison Essex used in those most early days.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
So we will now go back to the CNJ, who had built this long bridge across Newark Bay, where the unfortunate incident happened, over to Bayonne, and then came up the length of Bayonne, where that is where the Hudson Bergen light rail uses the right of way, a track adjacent to the what's left of the CNJ. And I'll talk about these other ones in a moment with the CNJ. So moving then more northward, that you had the New York, Ontario, and Western, the West Shore, and the New York, Susquehanna, and Western, that the Susquehanna built down in 1873, the NYO&W in 1869, and the West Shore in 1883, built down from the north. And so here's the West Shore in this orange. This is the Susquehanna coming down in the green. The O&W, if I remember right, had trackage rights on the West Shore down here to a place where they tunneled through the mountain to Weehawken, and it emerges now at Port Imperial, where the Hudson Bergen Light Rail uses that tunnel that was originally opened by the NYO&W way back then being 1883. At that time, they established that terminal at Weehawken. Now, the situation was, okay, so you get down here, but you want to interchange freight with the other companies. And then, so what they did is they built a connecting line down here to eventually one or more of them used Exchange Place. So we'll talk about Exchange Place on the PRR in a moment. So this is what the terminal in Weehawken looked like. There's where the tunnel came out. The Hudson Bergen Light Rail now turns this corner right here. So there was this massive terminal with the ferry boat terminals there, and then also the docks for freight transload. Then comes along the B&O. Well, the Baltimore and Ohio only got to Philadelphia, but through a series of arrangements, sometimes trackage rights and later control of the Reading and then the CNJ, the B&O got up to northern New Jersey and then built their own line to create a terminal, a freight terminal for themselves across onto Staten Island and around the corner. That is from St. George coming on back down is now the Staten Island Rapid Transit. I'm not going to dwell on this one because we're really about the Hudson waterfront, but I just wanted to throw that in so that you had a better picture of the whole story of the B&O. So you had the CNJ depicted on the right here with what must be the Blue Comet. You had the Reading that later on operated the Crusader. Interesting thing about this picture, the Crusader it was a double-ended train, so you didn't have to turn the equipment. So you've got the steam locomotive, but then you have a round-end observation car right behind it. Then you had the B&O that came up over the two railroads to provide that railroad with terminal facilities in New York for their passenger trains that went out to Cleveland and Detroit and Chicago. And then just an interesting little piece in this artist's depiction. There's a little Camelback engine over to the left that was used in the Jersey Central suburban services. So next railroad in it was the Lehigh Valley. I'm looking at my notes. The Lehigh Valley, they were the late builders. They came into Newark in 1891, and then in 1892, they opened their own line also across Newark Bay. The Lehigh Valley, even though they were a latecomer, they certainly were not shy about their advertising. In this case, they're advertising that they had block signals and that these two young women then could sleep on the train without worrying about being involved in a crash. The Lehigh, among the various railroads, is the one that never established its own terminal. They used a little terminal next to Communipaw for a while. In World War I era, they went together with the PRR as part of the USRA plan and operated their trains into Penn Station. But it wasn't, all the other ones had some kind of a dedicated terminal, and they didn't. So this is what the Lehigh facilities looked like. You had the Central to New Jersey at Communipaw, and we'll have some pictures of that in a moment. The Lehigh kind of slid in along the side, and then they had some other freight facilities here. Going up to the top is National Docks and NJ Junction. I've mentioned that the West Shore and the O&W needed to make interchange connections, and so this is the south end of that connection. So this is what the Lehigh Valley facilities looked like in Jersey City in early in the century. So we'll move on to the Erie. The Erie had originally been down at next to the PRR, but they had built their terminal at Pavonia. And the Erie was very, very aggressive in the 1900s of building a lot of suburban train lines, developing a big suburban service, and established several ferry boat operations. One of them I'm going to call special attention to is going to Castle Garden. Before Ellis Island was the port of entry for immigration, Castle Garden was the location. So you had the Erie Railway Emigrant Ferry. The Erie was really aggressive about promoting emigrant travel, emigrant is the term that you use when they're leaving Europe, and immigrant is what they are when they get here. But in the case of the Erie, I think they were thinking of immigrants in terms of the immigrants were still in their own minds, were still European people who were coming to the New World and kind of getting used to it. So several ferry docks. Chambers Street, we're going to revisit in a few minutes. I should also mention that by this time, the various transatlantic and intra-Western Hemisphere steamship lines had established piers on both sides of the Hudson. So it was getting to be kind of a busy place on the river, and we'll have a little more to say about that in a moment. So this is a depiction of the Erie ferry boat from Castle Garden. Erie-Eisenbahn. Eisenbahn is a German word for railroad. So this is no doubt part of an advertisement that was going to Germany to encourage people to emigrate to the United States, get to Castle Garden, ride the Erie-Eisenbahn ferry over to Pavonia, and then ride the Erie out to the various places in the East and Midwest and West and wherever they were going to. This was the Pavonia terminal. It was opened in 1887, and as the years went by, it was the giant suburban service and the inner city service outran the capacity of the terminal. But I'll have more to say about how it was that this terminal lasted all the way up to the 1950s and became a cause for the demise of the Erie's independent Hudson River terminal operation. This is what the Pavonia ferry looked like as you were facing the ferry terminal with your back to the ridge, and over on the other side of the ferry terminal would be the ferry boats and the Hudson River. You're taking note of this tower as part of the Pavonia terminal. I'm going to turn this around now. You're looking at that building now on the right, and we're going to introduce streetcars to our program here. So this is just to summarize now. We have the CNJ at Communipaw, the Erie, which over the years changed its name. At this particular time in 1891, that iteration was the New York, Lake Erie, and Western. And now we're going to go to see the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad never did anything halfway. They had to be the biggest and the best wherever they were. So they built their terminal at Exchange Place. That's Montgomery Street that you see there over to the left. The Exchange Place terminal, he looks at his notes. A little background. The PRR leased New Jersey Railroad and Terminal in 1871, and then built a new Exchange Place terminal in 1873, expanded it in 1884, and then built a new terminal coinciding with the track elevation in Jersey City in 1891. The Exchange Place name is rather descriptive. This is where you exchange passengers with the ferry boats, and here you have the ferry boats coming and going in the foreground. So a couple of pictures of this. This is a postcard. I come and go every day via PRR. Well, the person must have really liked that enough to write that on their postcard. Now, thank you, George Chiasson, for these diagrams of what the terminal looked like as rebuilt in 1891. They split out the passenger operations and the ferry docks from the freight at Harsimus Cove, which was occupying the site of that original Patterson and Hudson River terminal that had been relocated when the Patterson and Hudson River and Parent Erie moved up to the Pavonia location. So this is what the exchange place looked like inside the train shed. This is what it looked like outside the train shed. This is Montgomery Street with the trolley cars coming down to the ferry terminal. All of the terminals except Communipaw had trolley cars coming to them. And we'll have more to say about the trolley cars in a few minutes. So once again, we've now done Communipaw, Exchange Place, Pavonia. We're going back to Communipaw. This was the Jersey Central Terminal that the building still stands and is prominent from the Statue of Liberty. This is what it looked like from the air. I could sit and look at this picture for hours, all the stuff going on here, the passenger ferries, the car floats. It looks like a ferry boat over here in probably a servicing area. These were the transfer docks for moving the cars onto the car floats. There were freight transload facilities on the other side. The Lehigh Valley would have been right down in this area down in here. And then the massive train shed and train yards then for a company that just had a couple of routes into the city. It was amazing how much facilities they had there. So,
David, there was a question from Gregory Homatis. When was that Montgomery Street PRR terminal torn down?
I know it closed in 1961. That's the best I can tell you. I don't know whether it was torn down promptly after that. Right. I suspect it was torn down fairly promptly.
After that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So this building you can still see, well, at least as of 10 years ago, you could see this building in downtown Newark. I'm assuming it's still there. This is the Jersey Central Terminal in Newark. Jersey Central opened a second line straight across from Newark to Communipaw. Just an interesting thing about that, the CNJ, the PRR, the DL&W, the Erie, the Hudson and Manhattan, and Public Service of New Jersey streetcars all offered service between downtown Newark and the Hudson waterfront. So it must have been a really, really plum market. So the CNJ opened a second bridge across Newark Bay, and then they built a cutoff line coming down from the Newark line that eventually became really, really important because that's the access track to all of those container docks in the Port of New York, New Jersey. The main line, though, I need to emphasize, was the one that came across the Long Bridge and then up through Bayonne. So then there was the DL&W, and you don't even talk about the DL&W without their poetry associated with the road of anthracite. If up the bay he came today and asked to learn the shortest way, each wise, polite Manhattanite would answer road of anthracite. And I love their artwork here with Henry Hudson coming up past the larger-than-life Hoboken terminal. So a little background, the DL&W had leased the Morrison Essex back in 1868 and shifted operations. Originally, they had gone into, wait a minute. The DL&W had been associated with trackage rights arrangements with the CNJ. But in 1868, the DL&W began using the Morris and Essex, and then in 1863, they were using the Erie Long Dock until they couldn't. The one single track tunnel was a little too much for both the Erie and the Morris and Essex, now controlled by the DL&W. So in 1871, the Morris and Essex opened their own tunnel to the present day Hoboken site. They had a modest terminal there. We'll get back to Phoebe Snow in a moment. They had a modest terminal in Hoboken, but by 1900, in 30 years, the traffic volume had tripled, and we are going to see the whole. So in 1907, they opened the Hoboken terminal that we know today. So we don't even talk about the DL&W and their advertising without introducing Phoebe Snow. Phoebe Snow was a character from a 1900 era ad campaign that featured Miss Marion Murray. That was a real person that was the model for the many Phoebe Snow advertisements, each one with its own little rhyme that ended with the road of anthracite. Now it brings to mind that the Illinois Terminal Railroad out here in the Midwest, the Illinois Terminal. Can you hold on a moment? I'll be right with you. I can't. I'm trying to do the program here. If you want, yeah. I'm back. My wife's phone rang and she was having a conversation in the next room. So, but she's now we're back to Phoebe Snow. So Phoebe Snow, the whole point of Phoebe Snow was that the railroad burned clean burning anthracite coal, and that she could wear these white gowns on the train and presumably sit out on the open observation car and not be covered with soot. Well, steam engines are steam engines. And so the Illinois Terminal interurban out here in the Midwest, sometime World War I era, came up with their series of rhymes. And I won't recite the whole thing, except that they went through some poetry and said about Phoebe Snow coming from New York on the DL&W and then getting out to the Midwest. But Phoebe Snow traveled with her sisters, and it ends up with, so Phoebe Snow and her 6 sisters rubbed and scrubbed till they had blisters, to emphasize that the interurban was clean electric operation, and that even with anthracite, it was still sooty. Speaking of steam engines, I just have to mention that 60 years ago today, I went on my first CB&Q steam engine excursion, December 17th, 1961. Has nothing to do with anything, but I just wanted to tell you that. So, as I said, in 1907, they built the Hoboken terminal here, which wound up being kind of the, as in today, the kind of the center of the universe. This is a description or a depiction of all of the terminal trackage. So like Exchange Place and like Pavonia, there was both a passenger terminal and a freight terminal. So the passenger terminal was actually a rather small part of it. And the freight tracks with all of this stuff is really amazing. Merchandise traffic and coal and everything was all coming through this terminal. This is the terminal as it is today, and that picture where I was drinking beer was right up on about this corner, right up here. So in conjunction with the building of the Hoboken, the new big Hoboken terminal, they drilled a second bore through the mountains, so that when you are riding the commuter trains now, you have the 1871 bore and the 1908 bore. This is what the bores looked like in the 1990s. I don't recommend going up there now. You'll get chased out by the gumshoes. But when I took this in the 90s, you could pretty much walk around and just take pictures of what you wanted. So we're going to come back now to this picture that I showed you earlier, where the Erie Long Dock Tunnel was this one that curved around underneath there. And I'll have more to say about the second bore in a moment. And then this is the west end of the Morrison, Essex, Delaware, Lackawanna route going into the Hoboken terminal. So I mentioned the New Jersey Junction Railroad, that the West Shore had come down inland. There's a little trackage up here, but you can't go all the way up the coast. The shelf is too narrow. So the West Shore had come inland and then came through this tunnel, the same one that the Hudson Bergen Light Rail uses now, and then built this line down here so that they could gain access to exchange place for the passenger trains, and then also provide access for freight interchange to the other railroads, and then freight access to the voluminous number of industries that there were along the Hudson River lakefront, waterfront. You can tell I'm from Chicago. So that was still in operation in the 90s. This is a picture with a NJ Transit, former Erie-Lackawanna, former Delaware-Lackawanna, and Western, former Morrison, Essex train going overhead. And this is the New Jersey Junction train, by now, as you can see, operated by Conrail, coming underneath. This is the right-of-way that then was used by the Hudson Bergen Light Rail, since the city of Hoboken didn't want the light rail coming right up or down Washington Street. They did insist on the light rail doing a little bow thing around Hoboken. So we'll now go on to the streetcars. So as you saw, there were streetcars going to Pavonia, there were streetcars going to Exchange Place, there are streetcars going to Hoboken, and we'll have a look at the map here. This is from I'm going to reach around here. I need to give credit where credit is due. This is from the Edward Ham Public Service Trolley Lines of New Jersey book that I got in the 1990s and devoured it, and still I'm bewildered by all of the routes. But getting back to the story, you had streetcars coming down to Exchange Place, to Pavonia, to the DL&W. The 14th Street was not a railroad terminal, but it was a ferry terminal. And then the West Shore location. I'm going to call a special attention to the fact that this has to go kind of a curlicue up the hill, because all these routes are on the top of the hill. These are on the bottom of the hill, and right there you see this kind of a dashed line. That is the base of the Palisades. And so each time you've got to have a little squiggly line where the streetcars are snaking their way up the hill, unless they have an elevated trackage that you see right here. We'll talk about that in a moment. We're about to see a picture right here of a streetcar coming up from the West Shore, the West Shore ferry. The streetcars, like so many places, they evolved with independent companies that were pulled together as the Public Service Railway Company, and then eventually Public Service Transportation Company in 1923, that all of us knew of, all the way up into the bus era as Public Service in New Jersey, and then eventually in the 1970s as the power company really, it wasn't making any money anymore, and they prepared it for sale by turning it into Transport of New Jersey, and it, of course, eventually became NJ Transit. But I've gotten ahead of myself. There you have the West Shore terminal down there. This was the streetcar line finding its way into Pavonia alongside the Erie, and we're going to talk in a little bit about the new expanded Erie main line to get to Pavonia, because traffic was growing a lot, and that single track long dock tunnel just wasn't adequate anymore. At Hoboken, this was kind of the pièce de résistance of streetcar operation along the Hudson, and that was that way back in the 1800s, the Palisades Incline opened in 1874. It was a cable-driven inclined plane railroad, funicular, to use the proper term for it. He looks at his notes here for a moment. So it hauled horse cars until 1886. In 1886, the big elevated up top was built, but it was still cable driven. It wasn't until Frank Sprague came along and revolutionized electric propulsion that it actually then became an electrified line up there. So that they coexisted for a while. This is what the incline looked like. And then this is what the elevated looked like. It started out right down there at the Hoboken terminal, and on this very high trestle made its way up the hill. A little bit about the bottom of the hill down at the Hoboken terminal. They had a track arrangement that lasted right up to and slightly beyond the time of the opening of the Hoboken terminal. It was already an elaborate place, which, to their credit, they had a loop track, so they weren't having to change ends. But after 1910, as traffic was growing a lot, they did have to streamline the track arrangements to accommodate ever-growing traffic. This is what the network looked like up through the 1940s, the network of lines that used the elevated. There were 4 lines. Starting in the 1946, though, they started getting converted to bus operation once buses could climb up the hill on alternate streets. We'll have more to say about the end of the streetcars in a little bit. Oh, something I want to point out. The elevated came up the hill, and at about 2/3 of the way up the hill at Palisade Avenue, they actually had a place where cars would leave the elevated, and the elevated continued on. This is what it looked like from track level, almost certainly a fan trip. So that you'll see the switch going off to that building on the right is that building that you see right here. So the streetcars were just going along doing their jobs. The Erie, as I mentioned, was very, very aggressive about developing suburban services, and they built just a whole bunch of routes. We're going to come back to the Erie main line. The Erie main line from the Hudson waterfront came up this way through Patterson, and then on up to New York, and then to points west. They later built a cutoff line. There's also something that that we won't talk about in this program, but if I'm invited back to do part 2, I'll talk a little bit about how the Lackawanna had a route that came also up to Patterson. If you were a railroad, you wanted to get to Patterson because you had all that industry that had developed as a result of the water power and subsequent steam power. But the Lackawanna had their route that came up and then hooked around and came over to Mountain View and then went on west. And when the Erie-Lackawanna was established in the beginning of the 1960s, one of the things they did was to split those so that the traffic on the Lackawanna would come up on the former Erie line to Mountain View. This line between Patterson and Mountain View now is the site of Interstate Highway 80. Anyway, back to all of these suburban lines. You see them all there in red. There's one that's in blue. That's the New York, Susquehanna, and Western that also had its suburban service, though it wasn't quite as robust. But with all of these suburban services funneling into Pavonia, that was one whale of a lot of passengers, and the volume kept growing each year. They had outgrown the long dock tunnel. And so between 1906 and 1910, they undertook the building of what became known as the Bergen Arches. So they went from a single track tunnel to this 4-track main line. It became known as the Arches because they had overpasses at virtually every street. I think we'll have that's what it looked like. I'll come back in a moment, how it became known as the Arches. So it was an enormous undertaking, and it was enormously expensive with horrible cost overruns at a time when the Erie really couldn't afford it. The Erie was still laboring under the bonded indebtedness from all of the robber baron stuff that had happened in the late 1800s. And so they expended their entire terminal budget on building this. And when they were done, they were not able to build the new terminal building that they had expected to, that would match the elegance and grandeur of their arch rival DL&W at Hoboken. So the Pavonia station from 1887 lived on in its obsolescence. So this is where the Bergen Arches were. And this doesn't really depict where the old long dock tunnel had come down, but once again, you get the perspective of the DL&W passenger terminal, freight trackage, Pavonia, Harsimus Cove, PRR, freight trackage, the Exchange Place, PRR, passenger terminal, the Lehigh Valley, and then the CNJ, the B&O, and the Reading at Communipaw. So here's a graphic depiction of the difference of the single track long dock tunnel, which is still in operation. The Bergen Arches aren't. And we'll have more to talk about that in a little while. So this was the streetcar coming along, snaking its way across the new Bergen Arches cut. And we saw that before. So the Bergen Arches, by the way, when the Erie did move over finally to Hoboken, they were never used for anything. Or for many decades now, 6 decades, no agreement has been reached as to what to do, whether it should be a bike trail, a light rail line, a botanic garden, or just what. So let's look at the overall situation now at approximately turn of the century. The various lines that we've already talked about are here, and we're trying to get over to the Hudson over there. So you had enormous congestion because of all of these railroads coming in here, and the huge development of suburban services. And then you had to get across the River. So there were all these ferry boat lines crossing each other. Now, it might be one thing on a nice July day when the sun is shining, but what happens in the gales of November, as we call it out here in the Midwest, when the water is choppy and the visibility, it's foggy and rainy, and you not only had the ferry boats, but you had all those ocean liners. It would be an afternoon rush hour of ocean liners all leaving to go out to Europe and South America, etc. And then you had the freight boats all coming through here. I have a quote that I came across from someplace here. Hudson River and Upper New York Bay were so densely populated with the various railway and private ferries, tugs, barges, trawlers, and other ships of commerce from the small to the tall that it would have been difficult to row or swim more than a few yards without going afoul of one sort of vessel or another. So we'll just have a look at some of the ferry boats. Namely, this was a PRR ferry boat from Exchange Place. This is also a PRR ferry boat, DL&W. And then, as you can see, the ferry boat is going this way, but then you've got this, this carload barge going that way. You had coal barges. I'm not sure whose ferry boat that one is. And I included this image. I do not know what the occasion was here. They were obviously dedicating something. I don't know if it was a boat or a terminal or just what. But the point of this was to see in the background all these different ships. You're only looking at one ferry boat, but you're looking at a car float here and a cargo ship there. This is probably, I'm guessing, a Hudson River Day Line boat that's likely going up to Albany. So the harbor was jammed. The terminal, so now the Hudson River waterfront with the rail lines, they're building new facilities as fast as they could for expanding traffic. But nonetheless, the New Jersey side was jammed, the Hudson River was jammed, and the New York side was jammed. This is a depiction of the CNJ Ferries terminal at Barclay Street, right near the present day World Trade Center site. It's just, it boggles the mind to think that, people had to deal with this every day. The commuters trying to make their way through this, all of these people trying to get their freight back and forth through here. It was a mess, and it was getting worse. This was the Erie at Chambers Street ferry, a little less frenetic in these pictures, but nonetheless, at the rush hour, it would have been pretty intense. This is what the inside of the Chambers Street terminal looked like. Here is a depiction of just all the stuff. That doesn't look good. On the New York side, all of these tracks, you had railroad tracks, you had horse car tracks. This is sometime in the 1800s, probably before it was electrified, especially if it says railway stables. You had tracks leading into the various docks, White Star Line. I think those were the people that ran the Titanic. Coming to the ferry terminal, there's the Hoboken ferry. So what did you have here? You had just congestion on the New Jersey side, congestion on the Hudson River, congestion on the New York side. What are we going to do about it? And my suggestion is what we do about it right here, right now, is we take an intermission. And so while we think about when we return, what did we do about it? So Bob, how about 10 minutes?
Yes, 10 minutes is good. It is now 8:43. We will start at 8:53.
All right.
Sounds good.
I will meet you back here on the docks in 10 minutes.
10 minutes. This sounds good. And
don't anybody miss the boat.
Any of you wish to chat with each other, either in the chat or you can unmute now. I will mute all of you once again at 8:53. Yes, Andrew, I agree. I was just in Istanbul, so I saw the Bosporus myself.
Hi, Bob. I know you were over in Europe. You were just in Istanbul recently?
That was part of the same trip. We made in the middle of our Europe trip, we flew to Istanbul and back to Germany. Yeah.
How many days did you have in Istanbul?
Too short. We were like 4 days.
Oh, wow.
We barely doing between tourism and rail fanning. I mean, what we did was heroic, but
did you I guess you rode the whatever, the heritage tram?
Yes, we rode both of them.
The one in Moda on the Anatolian side?
Right. Yes.
Right. That makes a loop, and then you rode the one that goes along the shopping street?
Yes, we rode both of them. I think we didn't ride all of the tram line, the modern light rail. We did ride the newest light rail, which uses no trolley wire, but uses, I forget the name of the technology, but it gets from the ground.
Oh, yeah. I was in Istanbul for a whole week, but it's been 7 years.
Right. It was
still the old airport. It was still the old airport when I was there.
Right. And they don't have any metro service yet to either of the other airports. They're building it to the newest airport, but it's not done yet.
Right. And the Bosphorus tunnel was open. The railway tunnel was open, but it was only running limited commuter service.
It's like every 8 to 10 minutes now. That's the major rail crossing, and plus the one bridge over the Bosporus has the metro bus, which puts every BRT anywhere else in the world to shame.
What are they doing with the old railroad station, Sirkechi?
Right.
Was the museum open?
So we didn't check, but there is a Sirkechi station on the Underground Railway, but I don't know what they're doing with the old station.
The old station has a nice railroad museum in it.
Is that right? I wish. Oh well, we can't see everything. We'll go back. We might even, if our Greece trip works out, we don't rule out a future Turkey trip, because Jack May has been to Turkey, so, and obviously he's been, and so.
And the other place I went when I was in Turkey, I went to central Turkey, to Kayseri.
Oh.
Which has a light rail, and I rented a car to visit Cappadocia. There's no problem driving in Turkey, I'll be honest with you, except for Istanbul, where the traffic's horrible. The rest of the country
is easy.
Is easy, yeah. And I also visited Izmir, which has they have both a metro and a light rail. And
wow. And so does Ankara, right?
I didn't go to Ankara.
Oh, you didn't make Ankara. No. Well, anyway, I think between you and Jack May, we have Turkey covered in terms of technical knowledge. And we do have another member who's Turkish extraction, but he said he will not go as an interpreter until Erdogan is out of office. But we wouldn't be looking at Turkey until 2024 at the very earliest. Yeah. But
he's probably on his way out, fortunately.
He may be, yes.
Comment on the North River ferries. You showed some of the last routes, Barclay Street and Liberty Street, but actually the most used ferry terminal was 23rd Street, because CNJ, Erie, Pennsylvania, and electric ferries all used the 23rd Street terminal. Rather odd, but and that terminal, as the ferry service diminished, gradually, that of course they were all abandoned to that particular point. But there were many other services. For example, Lackawanna had Christopher Street. Barclay Street was the surviving one, and 23rd Street, as I mentioned.
Right.
So it was a whole network.
David, what's your last name? David P?
Oh, it's Dave Frainer.
Oh, Dave.
Oh, it's Dave Frainer. Hi.
Hi.
Hey,
Yeah.
very good. Nice.
One other comment too on the excursion liner that was wonderful photographs. Incidentally, David Wilson, they're just beautiful. The excursion liner was the Sandy Hook, which was off route there. It was going to an right there. That's the Sandy Hook, which ran from the Battery down to, well, Sandy Hook, but down to the Highlands. And an excursion service in a way, but it could be used for commuter service as well. In this particular, it's probably going up to Bear Mountain or to on a special excursion.
Mm-hmm. Dave Frainer, do you want to tell the group what your background is? Because you're very knowledgeable, and I know why, but tell the group what you did when you had your day job. Okay,
I worked initially for the Tri-State Transportation Committee, which became the Tri-State Regional Planning Commission, which became the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council, and I was executive director of the staff. And that is the metropolitan planning organization for the New York area, which means that it is a forum for developing a 5-year program for all surface transportation projects, whether they be transit or highway or marine. Right. And then I worked for the Port Authority and did some consulting work as well.
Yeah, I know Dave from his consulting days. What I was going to ask Dave is, when did you know Howie at NIMTIC?
Yeah, I knew Howie. Howie and I worked together. And unfortunately, there was in the last Tripper, it showed sort of a little eulogy for him.
Yeah, I was.
Yes, and
great guy.
And Dave Frainer, Joel Ettinger. I don't know if he's still on.
I don't know that he is. I was the first one, and then there were about 4 others before Ettinger. It was kind of a stepping stone, but yes, he was the last one that I'm acquainted with. I think it probably went on to somebody else.
Yes. Oh yeah, no, he's retired, but I'm just saying he is in the I'm looking to see if
he's on.
Hey, I'm on.
Hi, Joe.
Hey, I'm on. Hi, I was stepped away for a little. Hey, Dave.
Yeah.
Good to see another NIMTIC executive director.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we have a bunch of people from senior executive service from around the country. Walter Keeble from CTA, Walter Zulich from Metro North. I'm not doing justice. I'm looking through here. John Schumann is a prominent light rail consultant.
He was Mr. Light Rail. He worked for LRT. We worked on LRT up in the West Coast, and very instrumental in having Sacramento happen.
What, John Schumann?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is Bill? I don't see. Is Bill Vigris on? I don't see him on.
I don't recall letting. Oh, Carl Jackson is on.
Yeah.
He's almost current Mr. Streetcar. I just retired from. Carl, you there? You want to say hello? He's being silent partner. Right?
No, I'm there. Took me a little while to unmute. Hello, everybody.
Bob, Randy Litz to you. For some reason, I can't do any typing on into the chat at all. It's not responding. I don't know whose end it's on.
I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. That's the first.
Nothing showing up.
Okay. What you might want to do is log in again. That's what I would normally tell people. It might work on a re-log in. So just log out, log back in, and we're going to all actually.
All right, see what happens.
Okay. Very good. All right, David, are you ready? 1 minute.
I am ready.
All right, so once again, I'm going to mute everyone, and then David, you unmute. And one thing, I'm not going to identify the person. Once I mute you, please stay muted. If you keep unmuting, when I mute you, I will remove you from the presentation. Please stay muted. All your questions come through me until David Wilson concludes his presentation. All right, enjoy the presentation. I'm going to mute all of you. David Wilson, please unmute. David, unmute.
There we go.
Okay, great. Okay.
Welcome back.
All right.
During the break, we were talking about this particular scene here, and one of the knowledgeable people while viewing it said that this was a excursion boat that normally went down to New Jersey, that it was just happened to be up there for some kind of special purpose coming up the Hudson. And then someone has speculated that Abbott and Costello may be down in the crowd here someplace. But since this isn't an Abbott and Costello program, we'll take up where we left off, and that was the congestion, the incredible congestion on the New Jersey side. And I need to advance the picture side. There we go. The congestion at the terminals and basically what to do about it. The traffic was growing so fast that as new facilities would be built, they were already obsolete. And so places like Exchange Place had gotten rebuilt a couple times. The Lackawanna had completely rebuilt Hoboken, but everything was kind of straining at the seams with this growth, and what are we going to do about it? So the first thing that came along, there were, I'm skipping the H&M for a moment because I want to talk about the Hudson River Bridge, which was to have been this really amazing. I'll come back to the map in a moment. This is what the bridge was to have looked like. To get a sense of the scale, look at the railroad trains going across this bridge. That's for real. For real, had it happened. And it was not just somebody's dream. The ground was broken for this. The Pennsylvania Railroad was the leader on this project, but there was an expectation that, there's an expectation that this would have a Union passenger station, and the various railroads then would all funnel their trains across this giant bridge, and everybody would get into Manhattan. And as I described, ground was actually broken in 1895. But why did you have to have a bridge? Well, you had to have a bridge because you had steam engines. Steam engines couldn't run under the river. But Frank Sprague and others created an alternative, and that is, now we can tunnel. And so there actually had been two previous attempts to do a subway between Manhattan and New Jersey. I don't know what they would have done about steam engines in the earlier iterations, but the project was originally begun in 1873, abandoned in the 1880s, revived in 1888, and then abandoned again in the 1890s, perhaps when the big bridge was being proposed. But in 1901, William Gibbs McAdoo, who ultimately became Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law, became interested in reviving the project and really breathed serious new life into it. And by 1908 and 1909, the routes were opening. a couple of things were happening in New York all during this time. New York itself was growing, not just in terms of population, but the center of gravity was growing. Downtown, of course, with Wall Street and all that kind of stuff, was still a very, very important place. But increasingly farther north, for a long time, 14th Street was the center of the theater district, but Midtown was developing as a new nexus of economic activity, and therefore you needed to move a lot of people there. So
David,
when the Hudson
David, I've got one request. Can you turn your cursor back on? Because you were using it in a very useful way for pointing.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
There we go.
Okay.
So downtown, the traditional downtown central business district, but the city was growing northward, and some of the ferry services had already been beginning slowly, but then more rapidly going up to a nexus at 23rd Street. As we were talking about during the break, the importance of the 23rd Street ferry terminal. But by the time we got into the new century, Midtown Manhattan was becoming a new nexus of economic activity, and therefore a lot of people wanted to go there. And a lot of people wanted to go there from New Jersey. So when the Hudson and Manhattan was conceived, the idea was to stitch together the Exchange Place, Pavonia, and Hoboken. Conspicuously absent was Communipaw, but then to build these to the two nexus, I don't know what the plural of nexus is, nexi, to go over to downtown, to the site of the present day World Trade Center complex, and then to build a line up into Midtown. And the idea was to actually get all the way over to Grand Central Station. So it would link basically all of the terminals except for the CNJ at Communipaw. It would stitch them all together. In the original version of it, it did go up the hill to Summit Avenue, that's presently the Journal Square station, and we'll have more to say about going west in a moment or two. So the H&M, 1908, 1909, was being built and opened just at the same moment as the PRR was envisioning and constructing its own actual access to Manhattan itself, which is part of how the need arose to extend out from Summit Avenue out to what we're going to talk about in a moment. So before we talk about the PRR, I just absolutely love this postcard addressed to Mr. Phil B. Worth in Bushwick Avenue in Brooklyn. Hello, sweetheart, love from your own girlie. But the real special thing about this is on the front of the card, she said, let us take this trip on our honeymoon. Oh, girlie, if I weren't already married happily for 37 years, I'd marry you in a heartbeat. You want to take the Hudson and Manhattan on your honeymoon? Yeah, my kind of honeymoon. We have no idea whether they actually rode the H&M on their honeymoon or whether they even took their honeymoon, but it certainly was a wonderful thought on her part, and I'm hopeful that they had many years of happy marriage. But it just underscored the importance of the connection between Manhattan and New Jersey. Everybody's on their way to New Jersey. This is sheet music for a song. I've never heard the music. I'm not a terribly musical person. When I sing, I can carry a hippopotamus better than I can carry a tune. But nonetheless, it must be fun sheet music. Even the Lackawanna got into it. Now Phoebe Snow direct can go from 33rd to Buffalo. From Broadway Bright, the tubes run right into the road of anthracite. And it manages to capture both forms of transportation, the New York streetcar and the Hoboken terminal, where Phoebe Snow is now going to have an elegant ride up through the Poconos and on up to Buffalo. Maybe she'll even shuffle off to Buffalo. I don't know. So the H&M was underway. I love this diagram. I just included it just because I love the way it was depicted in the artist rendering. So the PRR had a direct connection to all of this, that they did extend then the line. This is going through Shanley's Cut out near Journal Square. You can see the PRR influence on this particular model of cars. I'm not here to get into equipment types and all that kind of stuff, other than just to illustrate the PRR influence. This was a yard that is out near the present day Journal Square station. That's Shanley's Cut in the background going through what's now Journal Square. So the H&M, part of the way the economics of the thing worked is they built this giant Hudson Terminal office building at the site of the present day World Trade Center complex. I'll have much more to say about this in part 2 if I'm invited to come back. But suffice it to say that the real estate, the rental of that building and whatnot, went a long way to subsidize the train operations. And that's one of the things that we, as we deal with, we stumble from transportation crisis to transportation crisis. For the entire time that I've been involved in understanding this stuff, generally speaking, you've got to have something in addition to the fare box to subsidize the service. And generally speaking, it's been real estate that was able to do that. So PRR influence continued all the way up into the 1950s. The company went bankrupt in 1954, I believe it was. But even then, while it was still an expectation for the H&M to be reorganized on an income-producing private sector arrangement, the PRR popped for some of these cars that I'll have more to say about in part 2 if I'm invited to do it. So this was the terminal at Hudson Terminal, people coming in and out past the turnstiles, and you can see Exchange Place, Grove and Harrison, and the first reference that I've seen to Journal Square instead of Summit Street. So enter the PRR. The PRR decided very early in the century, all right, we're just going to do it. We're not going to build the big bridge, but electric propulsion now has been perfected to the point where we can dig a tunnel and run the trains with electric propulsion from an engine change point out in New Jersey, under the Hudson River into Manhattan, build a station there, and then have what amounted to a many miles long tail track out to Sunnyside Yard, where you can loop around and just turn these trains and get them back. And just this vast capacity expansion in addition to just the convenience of getting to Manhattan. But that was only part of it. They built a line down to the Greenville Terminal. They actually opened this one in 1905, established a car float so that you could come all the way around and make a direct then carload connection to the the New Haven Railroad, as well as to have access to the vast amount of industrial might of the western end of Long Island. So what you see here is the PRR main line, just as it had been since New Jersey Railroad and Transportation way back in the 1830s. This, the new line to Greenville, the existing line down to Exchange Place with the ferry boats going here and there, and now the new line coming up and then tunneling under the Palisades and under the Hudson River, and then configured the way it is now. So the PRR undertook to do that, and they did it. And on November of 1910, they opened up the palatial Penn Station. Now, you'll seldom see me do a program when there's not, well, first we're going to just have another look at Penn Station in its majesty, but I seldom do a program without at least a little bit of cheesecake. This is a screenshot from the movie The Clock. I recommend this movie. It's just a real heartwarming story about this soldier in World War II who inadvertently breaks Judy Garland's shoe, and he volunteers to help her get it fixed, and then they develop into a romance, and I won't be a spoiler to tell you how it comes out, but it's just a wonderful movie. And this is a scene from it. And it features prominently Penn Station. So back to then the new Pennsylvania Railroad terminal arrangement with an electrification that came out to Harrison, New Jersey, where they transferred to steam. Well, they also then had a place where you needed a cross-transfer platform to be able for people who still wanted to go to Exchange Place. So they came up with the concept of Manhattan Transfer, which is the name of this program. Manhattan Transfer was the place where they changed from steam to electric. The H&M trains came out there. The Exchange Place trains came out there. So this is what it looked like early on when it was still a very simple kind of place. Here were I think these were DD1. I shouldn't speculate, but anyway, these were the early electrics that would shuttle then between Sunnyside Yard, Penn Station, out to Manhattan Transfer. And then they would be cut off, and the K4s or whatever would get put on, and the trains would then go on along the rest of the Pennsylvania Railroad network. And that's the way the Pennsylvania Railroad then was configured from 1910 until the late 1930s. Before we get to the 1930s, we're going to look at George Chiason's, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, diagrams, which he was kind enough to let me use, showing, we talked about the crossing of the Hackensack River. So this was kind of out in the meadowlands, hence the name PRR Meadows Yard. We talked earlier about how the DL&W used to come down through Shanley's Cut, but then they built their own line. But that meant that the two railroads were right next to each other through this particular area. And while it wasn't important in 1904 or 1909 or 1911, it was important much later on, and we'll hear about that. So this rather complex was established then to accomplish all those things, to change power, to allow people to exchange place trains, and to and as a place to transfer to the H&M. That configuration then lasted until the late 1930s, when the PRR, early in the 1930s, undertook a massive electrification. Then the rest of the way, from way up there all the way down to all kinds of places that you see on the map that we're not going to talk about because this is about northern New Jersey. But me see if I can get this thing down here. So there you have the New York complex, and then Manhattan Transfer had been right there just outside of Newark. Once you had an electrification that went all the way through, there was no reason to change power. And so coincident then, more or less, with the electrification, the PRR built the elegant new station, Newark Penn Station. The H&M that was going out to Newark to a separate location then was routed into the new station. The exchange place trains passed through the Newark station. So the Newark station took the place of Manhattan Transfer. After about 25 years of service, the Manhattan Transfer station then was eliminated. Pretty short life for me to make a whole program entitled Manhattan Transfer, but that's what I did. So this is the Newark station that was built in the late 1930s. It's already an awesome place. I understand they're undertaking a new renovation of it, so in the hopes of making a good place even better. So what this did then is it created the Pennsylvania Railroad as most of us knew it through our lives as children, adolescents, and grown-ups. This is the afternoon congressional from a wonderful publication that the Pennsylvania Railroad did for the stockholders about 1953 to try to convince them, I think they weren't losing money, to talk about all the wonderful things that the railroad was doing. I got a copy of that when I was about 4, and I still just absolutely treasure that document. So in the meantime, the PRR wasn't the first. Well, I mean, they had their electrification under the to the station, but as far as electrified suburban service, the DL&W beat them to the punch by electrifying the former Morrison Essex lines. This picture is taken at Gladstone. So they had the main line that went out to Dover, a little spur that went up to Montclair, and then this branch line that went down to Gladstone. Handsome cars inside and out. So meanwhile, what are we going to do? The traffic is still building. Yes, the PRR has built this new line into the city, but it is still just, we're still bursting at the seams. We're going to have to really start thinking about over the future. And this was Regional Plan of New York, where they just, this is not passenger counts, but trains per day, showing just how many trains there were in so many places and why everything was so jammed. So what are we going to do about it? They came up with this scheme. This scheme was proposed to have this series of belt lines around the city, and you would actually have then a series of Union stations at different places where people could interchange. Passengers could interchange from one line to the next without all having to pass through New York. Those who were needing to go into New York to originate or terminate could do so, but it would take the pressure off. So this was what was on the drawing boards, at least conceptually. But then something happened. The Lincoln Tunnel. I'm sorry, the Holland Tunnel. In 1927, the Holland Tunnel was opened, followed by the Lincoln Tunnel in 1937. So 10 years later, the Lincoln Tunnel was expanded twice, 1945, 1957. The opening of the tunnels ushered in the automobile era, and a lot of things happened. Industry started to disperse out to the suburbs. All of that need for rapid expansion wasn't there anymore. And in fact, rather promptly, especially aided by the Great Depression, it was not only a matter of coping with runaway growth, but it was more like coping with runaway contraction. Here is the Lincoln Tunnel. Lots of traffic. So services began to disappear. I should have told you at the intermission that you needed to go and get your tissue boxes here. 1949, the last Jersey City streetcars and Hoboken streetcars were discontinued, and the elevated line, the majestic elevated line, was torn down. This must have been a late fan trip. Oh, I'd love to have been that kid. So there are still some remnants. This was taken only a few months ago in downtown Hoboken. There's the 1907 terminal. That's the ferry terminal. And these tracks are still very much there, just waiting for them to reopen the elevated or something. Don't hold your breath. The PRR in 1949 discontinued the ferries to and from Exchange Place. You had the H&M, it duplicated the service. It wasn't like you needed to have the huge amount of capacity anymore. So the H&M was able to handle that. Then there was Pavonia. The Erie was just going along, doing what they'd been doing all along. There's the 1887 building there in the background. In the mid-1950s, the city of Jersey City condemned the building. And the Erie was faced with a dilemma. Okay, so we're not going to have the terminal here. What do? We can rehabilitate the terminal, we can replace the terminal, or we can seek a different alternative. Well, the Erie by that time was in poor enough financial condition that financing a rebuilding of the terminal didn't make any sense. It also didn't make any sense because they were losing piles and piles of money on the suburban service. And why would you put capital money into that? So what they did is they moved next door into the arch rival Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Hoboken terminal. Interesting, this is the notification for, he's looking for the date here, about 1958. It's actually important when it is. They started moving over in 56, but there were certain routes. The way the waterfront track connections were, there were some routes that just didn't afford you an easy access to Hoboken. So for another year, some trains continued to use the Pavonia terminal before they revised the track arrangements so that you could get all of the Erie trains into the DL&W Hoboken terminal. One of the things that's interesting about this notice here is it makes reference to the Erie-Lackawanna station. Now, they were still separate companies, but as it happened, that became the name of the merged company several years later. Another thing that I had never paid attention to this before was the Rockefeller Center motor coach. We'll talk about the B&O in a moment, but not for the suburban trains, but for passengers coming from west of or going to west of some particular Goshen, New York. And because I'm from the Midwest, I'm not real clear where Goshen was, but it was far enough west to make sure that this bus, where you could get through tickets to Rockefeller Center, was just used by the inner city riders. So what are your options? You can still ride the ferry boat to Barclay Street. It doesn't say anything about 23rd Street. So I'm guessing that they were expecting to ride the H&M to get up to Midtown and Lower Midtown. Anyway, that was what was just the next step in 1956. Then in 1950, well, the Susquehanna had opened a suburban location in 1939 with the expectation of doing a bus connection to downtown New York. You also had the George Washington Bridge that was open, and eventually the Susquehanna got so desperate to get rid of their suburban services that they offered each customer $1,000 if they would never ride the train again. And according to the report that I have here, there were only 5 takers on that. And I think it was ultimately declared, I think the court threw out that provision. Anyway, the Susquehanna soldiered on until 1966 when they ran their last suburban train. As I mentioned before, the very, very expensive Bergen Arches cut then just became an overgrown place that is still in search of its new use. Now let's go down to the B&O since we talked about bus connections. I put this in here because the next thing that happened was the B&O in 1958 cut their passenger service back to Baltimore and ended this really neat bus connection where the buses would meet the trains and then go over to Manhattan. At Communipaw, the buses would come right down the train platform, discharge their passengers for an outbound train, and then would be turned on a turntable so that they would be placed correctly to then receive passengers from inbound trains. I have to salute the companies for having that kind of care and taking to make it convenient for the passengers. I have a little personal story about this. After I did the CERA program about this very program a year ago, a person told me, a person went onto my Flickr site. I've got a Flickr site. I went and they've got thousands of pictures of buses. When I was 19 years old, I went to, I think it was Colonial Coach Lines in Trenton, New Jersey. And I have a picture of a Colonial Coach Lines bus with that thing on the side that said B&O Baltimore and Ohio. And somebody put those together and said, you know that you were looking at a B&O bus at Colonial Coach Lines in 1969. So they lived on somewhere for a while. I have no idea if anyone ever saved one of those. But anyway, 1958, now the B&O was gone. In 1959, the West Shore ended their suburban services, and so this terminal fell silent, as did the ferry boats. Then in 1961, the Lehigh Valley never ran suburban services, but they ended all passenger services effectively on the railroad, except for an RDC up around Hoboken someplace, or Hazleton, that ran a little bit longer. The Lehigh Valley the trains were pulled by GG1s. They actually had an engine change outside of Newark. In 1961, also the PRR ran the last trains out of Exchange Place. Then in 1964, the unthinkable happened. The demolition of the crown jewel, the Pennsylvania station in New York. But the carnage went on. this a CNJ, this goes back to about 1958. The CNJ was in pretty desperate condition. They had this huge money-losing suburban service. They had massive terminal arrangements there with very high property taxes. They were a short railroad. They weren't like the Erie or even the Lackawanna that had long-haul freight services. They went over as far as northeastern Pennsylvania, which wasn't very far. And so the company was already in pretty desperate condition by the late 1950s. The state of New Jersey could see that. And the state of New Jersey commissioned a study that was undertaken by the Pennsylvania Railroad. I'll have more to say about this in part 2, assuming I'm invited back, that said, why does the CNJ need to have its whole huge terminal at Communipaw, especially if there's no B&O? And I guess they hadn't really thought, or they didn't really know what was going to happen to the Reading. So the suggestion was made, well, there's hardly any trains going to Exchange Place. So let's have an arrangement whereby you use the Lehigh Valley up to Newark and then get on the PRR and go down into Exchange Place. And that would be the replacement for Communipaw. So that was in about 1958. They talked about it and they studied it and studied it and studied it. And finally in 1967, they implemented the plan. But by that time, Exchange Place was gone and they just made an arrangement whereby the trains would come off the CNJ. They would come up to near to Newark and then at a place called Aldine, New Jersey, which is why they called it the Aldine Plan. And then come into Newark and just change ends in Newark and come back out, which is what they did. I was in Newark in 2010, and this sign, maybe the sign's still there, I don't know, but it still made reference to the CNJ trains and the Pennsylvania, the Penn Central trains and the mainline trains. As a fan, I'm hopeful it's still there just because it's an artifact. As a passenger, I would find it to be terribly misleading. But so it was that was what happened to the CNJ trains up until NJ Transit took over and other arrangements could be made. So with the implementation of the Aldine Plan, the crowds of commuters that had come through Communipaw every day didn't. The Communipaw stood silent. The carnage continued. November 27th, 1967, the Lackawanna ended their last ferry service, and that meant that was the end of Trans-Hudson ferry service that had begun in 1812. The Erie-Lackawanna, by the former Lackawanna, now Erie-Lackawanna terminal, the ferry docks fell silent. Only the Staten Island ferry continued to ply the waters. So Jersey City by this time was a wasteland. Communipaw was gone, Exchange Place was gone, all of the support industries, all that freight that used to get transloaded was gone. And so Jersey City was kind of in tough shape. Now, that's not to say that people didn't really understand. It didn't catch anybody by surprise. And we'll talk about in a moment. We're going to now wind this program down by just talking about what happened then. So what happened then? You had all of these terminals that were gone. Only Hoboken remained. The H&M had gone bankrupt in 1954. It was taken over by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey in 1960. I should know this. There's probably all of you out there that can just rattle it right off. It was 1964, I think it was.
Somebody typed in, George Chason typed in 1962, and that sounds right to me.
Right, September 1st, 1962, right. So the H&M became the path. And Port Authority then did to what I think was just an amazing job of rehabilitating the property, upgrading the stations, getting the new cars. Then in the 1960s, the state of New Jersey had begun subsidizing the suburban services, but that eventually became untenable, especially after Conrail took over, because the federal law that created Conrail, and that while Conrail was still needing subsidies of its own, the federal law said Conrail, after thus and such a date, I think it was January 1st of 1983, was not going to be able to run suburban services anymore. Anybody who was subsidizing those, you had to take them over and make your own arrangements, trackage rights or whatever. MJ Transit had already come into being as an agency. We'll talk much more about that in part 2, if I'm invited back. But with MJ Transit, then all of the properties became part of one network, and MJ Transit had the flexibility then and the money to integrate the services and do some things that were quite innovative. I mentioned early on that way back when the Boonton line had been a Lackawanna line that came up right parallel to the Erie up to Patterson, and then cut across where I-80 is, and then came up this way. And then the Erie had its own branch that was going up that way. The Erie and Lackawanna, before the state intervened, had created this line out of Hoboken that combined those two, the Boonton line. And at the same time, there was the Erie line came out on this dash line, the Erie Railroad, the Greenwood Lake line. So if Bill Greenwood is on the call here, he can say, well, maybe it was named after me. The Greenwood Lake line came out like this, up through Montclair, around Great Notch, and then up to Mountain View, and then went straight north, and that's where it had crossed the Lackawanna. So the E&L, the Erie-Lackawanna, you can tell I'm an old railroad guy. I call it E&L. It's like the computer company, the IBM. So there was the old Morrison Essex electrified line to Montclair, and then this other line came within a few hundred yards of each other. So MJ Transit attached the two together, extended the electrification up to Great Notch, and then abandoned this section right in here. Ridership from those stations was very, very low, so it didn't really have a really bad adverse impact. A couple of the other things that happened at that time is that the Lackawanna electrification was old and in need of refurbishment. So they refurbished it in such a way that the voltage became similar, but not exactly like the Northeast Corridor, but it was similar enough that with a throwing of a switch inside the car, you could switch from one electrification to the other, which allowed coordination and installing switches where the Lackawanna and the Pennsylvania Railroad had been right next to each other, thereby allowing trains from various PRR places to come into Hoboken and allowing former Lackawanna trains to come into Penn Station. But that still left the Erie lines up here. What are you going to do about those? Which they came up with Secaucus Junction. Secaucus is misspelled in this. I got this from some kind of a publicity thing, and somebody wasn't really paying attention. Somebody wasn't proofreading enough. But this depicts the Kearney connection and the waterfront connection, where the two places where the two electrified lines had connecting tracks to allow for this swapping out of the services according to what they felt was necessary. In order to accommodate the riders coming down from way up north, Patterson, Passaic, and all those places, they built a place called Secaucus Junction. This is a diagram of it out in the Meadowlands. We should have pictures of it. You might have to wait for part 2 of this program if I'm invited back. But anyway, what happens is you've got the corridor trains underneath, and then you've got, or I guess over top, and the former Erie trains underneath, and just a wonderful, wonderful connection. In the meantime, Jersey City, the wasteland, nature abhors a vacuum, is the way the saying goes. Well, economics abhor a vacuum also. This was prime land that you had to do a lot of soil remediation and stuff, but this was just a wonderful place. I mentioned a wonderful place for redevelopment. As early as the early 1960s, the state of New Jersey and the city of Jersey City had collaborated on a plan to call this Wall Street West. They recognized that there were rising land values in Manhattan, supposing that you'd move back office operations over to lower priced land over here. So former railroad land, now here's Hoboken Terminal, here was where Pavonia was, here is where Exchange Place was, here is where those Lehigh Valley docks were, and then way over to the side there is Communipaw. So this was developable land. So along the way, I'm going to see if I can pronounce this guy's name right. Arthur Imprimatori, a trucking magnate, he invested in some land up at the Weehawken terminal of the West Shore, because that was all abandoned too, but there was no way to get there. So he started a ferry boat operation. And the various, especially the Port Authority, loved the ferry boat operation because the irony of the Hudson and Manhattan and then the path was that they had lost terrible amounts of ridership because of the automobile tunnels and all that. But most of that loss was on the off-peak. So they lost the fare box revenue, but they still had to provide peak capacity, and there needed to be overflow capacity. And so they began, the Port Authority began subsidizing the New York waterway ferries. At first only went to Port Imperial, the old West Shore dock. So Port Imperial with the ferry docks, and then with the eventual building of the Hudson Bergen Light Rail, became a little hub in its own right. This illustrates just how steep that Palisades is. There's actually a stairway back over there. If you moved there for Pittsburgh, you wouldn't know the difference, but there must be a lot of physically fit people at the top of the hill. So in the meantime, then they reestablished ferry service to Hoboken, first at a little terminal off to the side, but eventually then have reoccupied the old ferry terminal. And so what do you have? You've got that whole ferry boat network that you had all the way back when I showed that picture with the routes going this way and that. It's just that this ferry boat terminal is almost exactly where that CNJ terminal had been that I showed in those pictures. 23rd Street was now less important than getting up farther north to 39th Street to get closer to Midtown Manhattan. But also then it spawned ferry boat operations on the East River as well. You could take a couple of days just riding all of the ferry boat operations. So in 2000, they opened the first segment of the Hudson Bergen Light Rail that eventually got extended from all the way down along the old CNJ route the C&J main line. Then there was that C&J main line across from Newark where they used a little bit of that, where the C&J had hewn a cut out of across the south end of the Palisade, all the way up down past the various past Exchange Place, past Pavonia, past Hoboken. As I mentioned, they went around Hoboken on the New Jersey connecting track up to Port Imperial, and then used the old West Shore and NYO&W tunnel. So we're going to just wrap this up by saying, well, what happened then? What do these places look like now? First, we're going to just see the depiction of the light rail, stitching all this stuff together. The light rail. So this is what that wasteland looked like. What used to be a wasteland looked like in 2003, I guess this was. We're going to go to chapter 2 of this, if I'm invited back, to talk about what happened to the World Trade Center and how PATH trains were caught underneath the building when it collapsed in the September 11th attack. But what we got out of that was the marvelous new Oculus transit terminal. That's what it looks like on the inside. So there are the stations we've been talking about for the last hour and a half. This is the Weehawken, West Shore Weehawken location. Now the Hudson Bergen Light Rail and the Port Imperial multi-use complex. We've already talked about Hoboken, is now kind of the crown jewel of the whole place. Pavonia Newport got turned into a shopping center. I took this picture a few weeks ago when I was on my 18th trip to Hoboken. Exchange Place, there's Montgomery Street, the same as it's been since the 1800s. An Exchange Place now, we're looking through the same place where you saw the streetcars going in there, and then the PRR Exchange Place terminal and the ferry building in the background. Here's the Hudson Bergen Light Rail. So basically you've got streetcar tracks crossing a place where there used to be streetcar tracks. Communipaw got turned into the Liberty State Park. They've lovingly kept the train shed and remembered what was there. Looking to the future, just a matter of days ago, an administrative hurdle was passed to actually get started on construction of new bores into Penn Station. That construction, according to that press release, should start in the year 2022, finally, and take you into the new Penn Station that opened a year ago, the new Moynihan Train Hall. And that brings us back to New York, where we started. And I want to thank you for your attention while I told you more than you probably really wanted to know. But I'll now open it up for questions.
It was really beautiful. And before I open it up for general discussion, do you want to give the group maybe a 1 or 2 minute synopsis of what you cover in part 2? And then I'd like the group to give their reaction in chat and then in discussion if you would like a part 2. This is almost a rhetorical question, but because I already see some in the chat, but tell us what's covered in part 2, since I know you've presented it already.
So in this one, of course, I had the how things grew, and then we got the box of tissues out while we all shed tears about how everything then started to disappear. I take it up really with the bankruptcy of the Hudson and Manhattan. That was the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, that, hey, you know what? We got a big problem here. Private enterprise cannot sustain all this operation anymore. We've got to think of a different model. So I will walk through the path taking over the Hudson and Manhattan, how the original subsidies came to the commuter rail lines and how the state of New Jersey paid for new equipment. And I actually will talk a little bit more about the equipment, the Comet cars and the new MU cars and locomotives and stuff that were publicly financed. I'll go into a lot more detail about how NJ Transit stitched all that stuff together and what were what went on in Jersey City that brought about Hudson Bergen Light Rail. And then I'll just bring it up to exactly where it is right now.
You can count on, I'm not the program chairman, but am the president, and I have a lot of influence in what the program chairman does. You can rest assured that, and I'm getting a lot of comments, which you will see too. We definitely would like you back for part 2. So before I open it up for discussion, just a reminder, next meeting is January 21st. This program was recorded, but we are going to change the procedures. You will see it on the website. You will be asked to email either the an ERA email or email me directly. And then we will give you a private link. And at this point, I think everybody is invited to unmute. I'm going to ask all to unmute. Each of you have to turn on your video. But again, I thank you, David. It was an outstanding presentation. I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone here. And please feel free to turn on your video, and we're opening it up for comments and questions directly to David.
I just wanted to comment about the book that I'm holding up before you. I don't know whether you can see it or not. It's called Conquering Gotham by Jill Jonas, and she produced it in 2007. And David, if you don't have it, you really need to get a hold of it, because it tells the story in vast detail about not only the building of Penn Station, but also the East River and North River connections. A very, very fine book that received very, very good reviews. It's called Conquering Gotham, and it was produced in 2007 and 2006. And it was also presented at the Transportation Research Forum, which I don't know that exists anymore. But anyway, there's my suggestion. Very fine presentation, David. And incidentally, our son's name is David Wilson Frainer.
Okay, well, it's a really great name. I've enjoyed having it for 72 years. And I thank you for pointing that book out. I was not familiar with that book. So I have written that down, and maybe if it's not too late, maybe I could write a letter to Santa Claus and see if Santa Claus would bring it to me for Christmas.
Right, on eBay. Now, David Wilson. Oh, yeah, Peter. Yes, Peter Strauss.
Yes, David, speaking of books, this was not only an excellent slide presentation, but I think you have a real book in you here, and I'm hoping that you would think of making, essentially allowing this research to become permanently accessible to people and turning it into a book. It would be a wonderful book with a lot of work that you've done here.
That's an intriguing possibility, and if I might just engage in a little shameless self-promotion, about 2 years ago, I did a CERA program in Chicago about the building of the Congress Expressway and how they had to move the Garfield Park L out of the way. And it started out just to be a CERA program. And they said, well, would you mind doing that as an article? And it expanded and expanded and expanded, and eventually became a Shoreline Interurban Historical Society freestanding book. So I'm noting very carefully what you had to say because it's an intriguing possibility.
And David, notwithstanding what Dave Frainer mentioned, it sounds like an excellent resource book. I think probably a lot of your part 2 material was probably very new material that no one has ever stitched together. And that's would be the value of, like Peter said, of you putting a book together. I mean, yes, there are histories that are written, but history keeps evolving, and you've captured the modern history, and putting both of them together would really be amazing.
Yeah, I have a question. There's a book by, it's a two-part book that I don't know if anyone else knows of. I only have part one, called The Port of New York by Carl Condit.
Yes.
You're familiar with that one.
I'm going to reach down
there
here.
You go. Okay.
My New York shelf. And I don't know if anybody can see this, but
yeah, that's volume 2. I don't have volume 2. I only have the first.
I believe some of the maps were from that book in your presentation, right, Mr. Wilson?
Yes, there were. Especially the part about what happened in the 1920s, where they were still planning for unbridled growth.
You should think about retitling your presentation "Trans-Hudson Travel by Transit and Rail Transit," because really you've opened up. It's far more than just Manhattan Transfer. It's everything prior to and after. Very, very comprehensive, and so that would be a suggestion. Also, the maps were a very important part of your presentation. I would urge you, if you decided to publish something, to include the maps that you've shown, because they were excellent.
We'll see what we can do about to maps, to emphasize the maps. There's just, it's like such a spaghetti bowl of lines that you have to, it's like untying the knot in your shoelace. It's everything goes this way and that, and I have to pull them apart to see which one actually goes where.
Yeah, if you did it in some way digitally, what would be interesting is especially that business of how the Erie-Lackawanna lines got glued together, taking the old Lackawanna line and abandoning the Erie through Passaic, and then the Totowa. That's really hard to draw unless you do it somehow. When books used to do overlays, if you remember, they would do like a clear sheet, and you would have another map below it. As you said, it's very complicated.
Okay, I'm going to break in for a minute. I do want to continue the chat, but I'm hearing some background. I'm going to do something a little different, which I think Jeff suggested. I'm going to mute all of you. And David, you unmute, I unmute, and then please only unmute if you wish to talk. And once you're done, please mute yourself again, okay? So I'm going to mute you all, but David, myself, and then whoever wishes to speak one at a time, mute, say your piece, and then please mute again. Okay, David, please unmute. All right, you're on. Okay, so anyone wishes to say something, just them unmute, okay? Don't all speak at once here.
Oh,
Jeff,
I was also going to say to David, thank you. I did watch your the one you did for CERA on the Garfield Park. That was just fascinating, and how that was moved. I have to get the book on the one that you turned, that it's turned into a shoreline book. I have to order that
shoreline book. Yeah.
Great. So anybody else is also welcome to unmute and speak. We just want to have it sort of one at a time so we don't get the background noise, okay? Anybody else? Anyone is free to speak.
Yes, Jeff, I put the highly critical comment about the 2nd Avenue subway, somewhat conditioned by the fact that I was born in Yonkers and remember going all the way.
You might want to say what your comment was. I don't know if you had a chance to read it. I did read it, but why don't you, for the group, say what you actually said?
Was I not muted? I'm not speaking.
No. I'm saying what you wrote it in the chat about the 2nd Avenue subway. Everyone may not have read it, so why don't you tell everyone what you said?
Yeah, but I remember riding the 3rd Avenue L all the way to its end, at least down to Macy's when I was a kid in Yonkers in the 50s.
Very interesting. All right. I'm gonna see if I can find the comment. Oh, shoot. Okay. Anyone else? This is your chance. Once again, David, yeah, go ahead.
I had in the chat that there was wasn't a Grand Central terminal designed to take the West Shore lines in from another tunnel on the Upper West Side? Was there was intention that
I'm not aware of it. Just it's hard to think about the geography.
They had proposed tunnel. I saw on a map somewhere proposed tunnel from like the West Shore over to the Upper West Side of Manhattan and then across over to Grand Central. That could have been just the person who drew the map, but that's
might have been. I'm not aware of one, and it's a little hard to think about what the benefit would have been for the New York Central, where would they have had enough ridership from the West Shore to justify a capital project of that enormity?
Okay.
I have a question for anybody who's on who might still know. I just became aware that East Side Access goes all the way down to 38th Street. And I know East Side Access is very deep. Is there any, is it so deep that it's too deep that it would come up too far under Penn Station if they could extend it the 5 blocks farther south?
What I'm going to tell you, Andrew, I don't think he's on today, but I can give you Paul Grether is the project manager for the service plan for East Side Access. If anyone knows the answer to that, he probably does.
This is Will, everybody. Hi, Bob. No, Andrew, I think what you're thinking about, what I have read in the past is that the tunnel boring machines were driven south past the site of the station box and are basically parked under there, parked as far south as 38th Street, like near the Katana Hotel or something down there. And but the station box itself doesn't go much past like 41st or so underneath Grand Central. But that's what I have read. It could be wrong. And like Bob said, Paul Grether probably knows a heck of a lot more.
Thanks. Not that it would happen in my lifetime, but it would be interesting if they did connect the two of them together.
I have a comment about, Andrew, one of your comments about the CNJ station being used for the filming of Funny Girl. There was a error that only fans, I think, would know about on Funny Girl, where she gets on the tugboat. It's a New York Central tugboat. Now, this is back in the 20s or so that it was set, and it's got a Robert Young, Alfred Perlman era New York Central logo on the smokestack of the tugboat. A terrible error that they should have just pulled the whole film because of that.
Right.
Len Batchelder, if you are still, I think you're still in the chat. You had made a comment about commuter service went beyond on the Lehigh Valley, went beyond what David mentioned. You want to explain that? Since we have a lot of local knowledge here, if you hear me, feel free to unmute. I guess not. All right. Any other? Oh,
Bob, it's me. I think I have a timetable. I believe Lehigh Valley had one train a day that went to Flemington, New Jersey.
And to what year? You did say that in the chat.
Somewhere into the 50s, only a year or two. I mean, very close to when they abandoned all service in '61. So I'm not sure.
Okay. And go ahead.
And we're just going to look up this right now. Oh, I just turned right to the Lehigh Valley. And I just opened the book and it came right to the Lehigh Valley. And we're going to see if it shows the local or not. This is 1954, and I think it was already gone by 54. But I do recall that there was a train it functioned as the local, but what it didn't do was provide enough service to warrant having what I would call depot suburbs, a whole little community around the depot where people commute regularly on the Lehigh Valley, not like on CNJ. There are some of my favorite depot suburbs in New Jersey.
Mike Glicken here, it was a gas electric car as late as the 1950s. In 1954 sounds right.
Yeah, it was a gas electric doodlebug.
Right.
Wow. Amazing. Okay. Any other?
Yeah,
David is showing a book here. David Frainer. I'm sorry. David, you want to unmute yourself? David, you need to unmute.
Okay.
There you go.
Shameless promotion on David's behalf. This is your book on the Garfield L, and it's a wonderful story of a bad thing that happened in a way about the loss of the Chicago Aurora and Elgin and the Congress Street Expressway and everything. It's a wonderful, wonderful story. So let me just show you a part of it right here.
Is it on the CERA website, David Wilson?
This was, David can explain it better. It's actually an organization, it's called Shoreline.
Oh,
it's the Interurban Historical Society. And it's a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Can you turn that around and show us the back? I have a personal interest in these particular pictures. The building that you see on the left with the blue awning, over to the side. I moved into that building in 1981, exactly 40 years ago this past July, and I lived there for 3 years before my wife and I got married.
Oh golly!
So that's a very familiar intersection. These are two pictures of the exact same location, grade level, and then with the expressway there and the L moved over to the side.
Yeah. It really is. And there's a lot of great before and after pictures here. Wonderful, wonderful thing. So what you got to do is replicate this for us in the New York.
Okay, it's available on the Shoreline Interurban Historical Society website.
Okay.
Hey, David, I have a question. When you lived in a place like that next to an expressway, how noisy was it?
Yeah, it's a funny thing about noise that you not only get adjusted to the noise, expressway noise. I could lay in bed in the morning and predict the weather in the sense that if it's a rumble, it's just regular weather. If it hisses, it means it's raining, and if it's muffled, it means it's snowing. But the other thing about it that with the steady noise, you not only get so acclimated to it that if there was a gap in traffic during the night, it would actually wake me up. People who live next to the L, or anything like that, you just kind of get used to it, and it just becomes part of daily life. It was wonderful living there because it was the expressway. There was always something going on. Plus, the L went by next to it, and then the Soo Line Railroad went by next to it as well. So I could look out my window and just see transportation all day long. And the irony of it was that I later went to work for the successor to the Soo Line, the Wisconsin Central.
Ambient noise has sometimes a soothing effect. Yeah. And the absence of it, as you point out, sometimes if you're in a very heavy snowstorm and traffic subsides, you all of a sudden understand the meaning of silence. That's why I go up to New York to the woods every year from Georgia, because it gets away from the noise and light.
No, I asked because I lived not as close to an expressway, but still within earshot. And what was noticeable in the place where this was when I was living in Toronto, one of them is that you get the very fine soot or whatever it is that, you know, dirt, and you don't really notice it, but it comes in and you can see it on your floors and things that I had to clean a little more often than I would have thought. I don't know if that was noticeable when you lived so close to such a, you know, a busy road.
Interesting. Okay. Are there any other comments or questions for David Wilson? There's so many Davids on here. That's why I'm always having to first and last name here. And I will be in touch with you, David Wilson, as far as when the recording is available, and also if you don't already have it from CERA, as well as the scheduling of part 2. There definitely is a lot of interest that went without saying that we would like you back for part 2.
All right. Well, I'm honored that you that you like this one enough that you want to see the second one.
Oh, absolutely. Well, when you hear Peter Strauss saying, "When are you writing the book?" I mean, that says it all. And I see all the smile. Are there any other comments or questions before we head off for the evening? And when you get the recording, I think you know you get the comments too. So
yeah, thanks for the great show. And we are looking forward to part 2.
Great. All right. Well, I'll just be ready when the time comes.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
All right. So everyone have a good holiday season. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. And we will see you in 2022. And we'll see David Wilson sometime 2022. Okay.
Robert, thanks for running a good show too.
Thank you, David. Frainer, thank you. All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.